Where are they going? Part 1. That very day, toward 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jean Valjean was sitting alone upon the reverse of one of the most solitary embankments of the Champ de Mars. He was now calm and happy in regard to Cosette. What had for some time alarmed and disturbed him was dissipated, but within a week or two anxieties of a different nature had come upon him. One day, when walking along the boulevard, he had seen Thénardier. Thénardier here? This was all dangers at once. Moreover, Paris was not quiet. The political troubles had this inconvenience for him who had anything in his life to conceal, that the police had become very active and very secret, and that in seeking to track a man like Pepin or Moret, they would be very likely to discover a man like Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean had decided to leave Paris, and even France, and to pass over to England. He had told Cosette, in less than a week he wished to be gone. He was sitting on the embankment in the Champ de Mars, revolving all manner of thoughts in his mind. Thénardier, the police, the journey, and the difficulty of procuring a passport. On all these points he was anxious. Finally, an inexplicable circumstance, which had just burst upon him, and with which he was still warm, had added to his alarm. On the morning of that very day, being the only one up in the house, and walking in the garden before Cosette's shutters were open, he had suddenly come upon this line scratched upon the wall, probably with a nail: 16, Rue de la Verrerie. It was quite recent. The lines were white, in the old black mortar. A tuft of nettles at the foot of the wall was powdered with fresh fine plaster. It had probably been written during the night. What was it? An address? A signal for others? A warning for him? At all events, it was evident that the garden had been violated, and that some persons unknown had penetrated into it. In the midst of these meditations he perceived, by a shadow which the sun had projected, that somebody had just stopped upon the crest of the embankment immediately behind him. He was about to turn round when a folded paper fell upon his knees, as if a hand had dropped it from above his head. He took the paper, unfolded it, and read on it this word, written in large letters with a pencil: Remove. Jean Valjean rose hastily. There was no longer anybody on the embankment. He looked about him, and perceived a species of being larger than a child, smaller than a man, dressed in a grey blouse and trousers of dirt-coloured cotton, which jumped over the parapet and let itself slide into the ditch of the Champ de Mars. Jean Valjean returned home immediately, full of thought. Part 2. Marius had left M. Gillenormand's desolate. He had entered with a very small hope. He came out with immense despair. He began to walk the streets, the resource of those who suffer. He thought of nothing which he could ever remember. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he returned to Courfeyrac's, and threw himself, dressed as he was, upon his mattress. It was broad sunlight when he fell asleep, with that frightful, heavy slumber, in which the ideas come and go in the brain. When he awoke, he saw standing in the room, their hats upon their heads, all ready to go out, and very busy, Courfeyrac, Enjolras, Feuilly, and Combeferre. Courfeyrac said to him, "Are you going to the funeral of General Marc?" It seemed to him that Courfeyrac was speaking Chinese. He went out some time after them. He put into his pockets the pistols which Javert had given him at the time of the adventures of 3rd of February, and which had remained in his hands. These pistols were still loaded. It would be difficult to say what obscure thought he had in his mind in taking them with him. He rambled about all day without knowing where. It rained at intervals. He did not perceive it. For his dinner he bought a penny roll at a baker's, put it in his pocket, and forgot it. He waited for night with feverish impatience. He had but one clear idea. That was, that at 9 o'clock he should see Cosette. This last happiness was now his whole future. Afterward, darkness. At intervals, while walking along the most deserted boulevards, he seemed to hear strange sounds in Paris. He roused himself from his reverie and said, "Are they fighting?" At nightfall, at precisely 9 o'clock, as he had promised Cosette, he was in the Rue Plumet. When he approached the grating, he forgot everything else. It was 48 hours since he had last seen Cosette. He was going to see her again. Every other thought faded away, and he felt now only a deep and wonderful joy. Those minutes in which we live centuries always have this sovereign and wonderful peculiarity, that for the moment while they are passing, they entirely fill the heart. Marius displaced the grating, and sprang into the garden. Cosette was not at the place where she usually waited for him. He crossed the thicket, and went to the recess near the steps. "She's waiting for me there," said he. Cosette was not there. He raised his eyes and saw the shutters of the house were closed. He took a turn around the garden was deserted. Then he returned to the house, and mad with love, intoxicated, dismayed, exasperated with grief and anxiety, like a master who returns home at an untoward hour, He rapped on the shutters. He rapped again, at the risk of seeing the window open and the forbidding face of the father appear and ask him, "What do you want?" This was nothing compared with what he now began to see. When he had rapped, he raised his voice and called Cosette. "Cosette!" cried he. "Cosette!" He repeated imperiously. There was no answer. It was settled. Nobody in the garden. Nobody in the house. Marius fixed his despairing eyes upon that dismal house, as black, as silent, and more empty than a tomb. He looked at the stone seat where he had passed so many adorable hours with Cosette. Then he sat down upon the steps, his heart full of tenderness and resolution. He blessed his love in the depths of his thought, and he said to himself that since Cosette was gone, there was nothing more for him but to die. Suddenly he heard a voice which appeared to come from the street, and which cried through the trees. "Monsieur Marius!" He arose. "Hey?" said he. "Monsieur Marius, is it you?" "Yes." "Monsieur Marius," added the voice, "your friends are expecting you at the barricade in the Rue de la Chanvrerie." This voice was not entirely unknown to him. It resembled the harsh and roughened voice of Éponine. Marius ran to the grating, pushed aside the movable bar, passed his head through, and saw somebody who appeared to him a young man, rapidly disappearing in the twilight. Part 3. Monsieur Mabeuf had continued to descend. The experiments upon indigo had succeeded no better at the Jardin des Plantes than in his garden at Austerlitz. The year before he owed his housekeeper her wages. Now he owed 3/4 of his rent. The pawnbroker, at the expiration of 13 months, had sold the plates of his flora. Some coppersmith had made saucepans of them. His plates gone, being no longer even able to complete the broken sets of his flora which he still possessed, he had given up engravings and text at a wretched price to a second-hand bookseller as odd copies. He had now nothing left of the work of his whole life. He began to eat up the money from these copies. When he saw that this slender resource was failing him, he renounced his garden and left it uncultivated. Before this, and for a long time before, he had given up the 2 eggs and bit of beef which he used to eat from time to time. He dined on bread and potatoes. He had sold his last furniture, then all his spare bedding and clothing, then his collections of plants and his pictures, but he still had his most precious books, several of which were of great rarity. Among them a Diogenes Laertius, printed at Lyons in 1644, containing the famous variations of the manuscript 411 of the 13th century in the Vatican, and of those of the 2 manuscripts of Venice 393 and 394, so fruitfully consulted by Henri Estienne, and all the passages in the Doric dialect which are found only in the celebrated manuscript of the 12th century in the Library of Naples. Monsieur Mabeuf never made a fire in his room, and went to bed by daylight so as not to burn a candle. It seemed to him that he had now no neighbors. He was shunned when he went out. He was aware of it. The misery of a child is interesting to a mother. The misery of a young man is interesting to a young woman. The misery of an old man is interesting to nobody. This is, of all miseries, the coldest. Still, Father Mabeuf had not entirely lost his childlike serenity. His eye regained some vivacity when it was fixed upon his books, and he smiled when he thought of the Diogenes Laertius, which was a unique copy. His glass bookcase was the only piece of furniture which he had preserved, beyond what was indispensable. One day, Mother Plutarque said to him, "I've nothing to buy the dinner with." What she called the dinner was a loaf of bread and 4 or 5 potatoes. "On credit," said Monsieur Mabeuf. "You know well enough they refuse me." Monsieur Mabeuf opened his library, looked long at all his books one after another, as a father compelled to decimate his children would look at them before choosing, then took one of them hastily, put it under his arm, and went out. He returned 2 hours afterward with nothing under his arm, and laid 30 sous on the table, and said, "You will get some dinner." From that moment, Mother Plutarque saw settling over the old man's white face a dark veil which was never lifted again. The next day, the day after, every day he had to begin again. Monsieur Mabeuf went out with a book, and came back with a piece of money. Volume by volume the whole library passed away. He said at times, "I am 80 years old, however," as if he had some lingering hope of reaching the end of his days before reaching the end of his books. His sadness increased. Once, however, he had a pleasure. He went out with a Robert Estienne, which he sold for 35 sous on the Quai Malaquais, and returned with an Aldine, which he had bought for 40 sous in the Rue du Cré. "I owe 5 sous," he said to Mother Plutarque, glowing with joy. That day he did not dine. He had acquired the habit, every evening, before going to bed, of reading a few pages in his Diogenes Laertius. He knew Greek well enough to enjoy the peculiarities of the text which he possessed. He now saw no other joy. Some weeks rolled by. Suddenly Mother Plutarque fell sick. There is one thing sadder than having nothing with which to buy bread from the baker. That is having nothing with which to buy drugs from the apothecary. One night the doctor had ordered a very dear potion, and then, the sickness was growing worse, a nurse was needed. Monsieur Mabeuf opened his bookcase. There was nothing more there. The last volume had gone. The Diogenes Laertius alone remained. He put the unique copy under his arm and went out. It was the 4th of June, 1832. He went to the Porte Saint-Jacques and returned with 100 francs. He laid the pile of 5-franc pieces on the old servant's bedroom table and went back to his room without saying a word. The next day, by dawn, he was seated on the stone post in the garden, and he might have seen, from the hedge, all the morning motionless, his head bowed down, his eyes vaguely fixed on the withered beds. At intervals he wept. The old man did not seem to perceive it. In the afternoon extraordinary sounds broke out in Paris. They resembled musket shots, and the clamour of a multitude. Father Mabeuf raised his head. He saw a gardener going by, and asked, "What is that?" The gardener answered, his spade upon his shoulder, in the most quiet tone, "It's the emeute." "What emeute?" "Yes, they are fighting." "What are they fighting for?" "Oh, lordy," said the gardener. "Whereabouts?" continued Monsieur Mabeuf. "Near the arsenal." Father Mabeuf went into the house, took his hat, looked mechanically for a book to put under his arm, and did not find any, said, "Ah, it is true," and went away with a bewildered air.